My daughter gave her mother-in-law a $24,000 diamond bracelet and a week in the Caribbean. My gift was an empty picture frame from the dollar store. Empty because she never found 5 minutes to put a photograph of the two of us inside it. Here's what she didn't know while she was busy impressing her husband's family. For 15 years, I had quietly kept every receipt, every contract, every wire transfer that ever passed between us. 3 weeks after that Mother's Day, I sat across a conference table from my attorney and signed the paperwork that would end the comfortable life my daughter had built without ever once noticing whose hands were holding it up underneath her. The next morning, my phone rang 19 times before 10 o'clock. I'm 65 years old. I built a consulting firm out of a card table in my spare bedroom into a company with 20 employees and an office on Peachtree Street. These days, most of my clients are younger entrepreneurs, a lot of them women, most of them Black, all of them convinced they have to arrive twice as prepared as anyone else in the room before somebody will finally take them seriously. 2 months before that Mother's Day, I spent a Saturday afternoon walking a 29-year-old client named Aisha through her first commercial lease, refusing to let her leave my office until she could recite her own numbers back to me without glancing at her notes once. I have negotiated 7-figure deals with men who assumed I wouldn't understand the figures on the page in front of me and then watched their faces when I did. I have never once in 30 years been afraid of a hard conversation about money. But none of that, not one bit of it, prepared me for the particular kind of heartbreak that comes from realizing your own daughter had learned to see me the way you'd see an ATM. Reliable, useful, and when it comes to anything that actually matters, easy to walk right past. If any part of you just felt something tighten in your chest, if you know what it's like to give and somehow become smaller in your own family's eyes with every gift, stay with me. Maybe you're 60 or 70 watching this from a kitchen of your own, and some part of you has quietly learned to expect less than you deserve because you've been told in 100 small ways that a certain age means you ought to be grateful for whatever you're handed. I used to believe that too. Tell me what city you're watching from, because I have a feeling this story is going to travel further than I ever expected it to. My name is Sonia Ellison, and this is the story of how an empty picture frame taught me more about my family in one afternoon than 36 years of loving them ever had. I should tell you up front, this isn't a story about hating my daughter. I don't. Not even now. This is a story about what happens when love quietly turns into a debt nobody ever calls in until the day somebody finally does. Let me back up. I grew up in Southwest Atlanta, in a house where money was talked about in whispers, like it was something shameful to need out loud. My mother cleaned houses for families on the North Side who called her by her first name and expected ma'am in return. I remember riding the bus with her once maybe 9 years old and watching a woman she'd worked for walk right past us on the sidewalk without so much as a nod. The same woman my mother had brought soup to twice the winter that woman's husband was sick. My mother didn't say anything. She just held my hand a little tighter and kept walking. I watched her come home some nights too tired to eat, and I promised myself 2 things right around that age. I would build something that couldn't be taken from me, and I would never again let anyone make me feel small for wanting to be paid what I was worth. I got my MBA at night, working full days at a firm downtown. 10 years in, I watched 2 men I had personally trained get made partner in the same year I was quietly passed over. I still remember sitting in that meeting in a blazer I'd pressed twice that morning, listening to a managing partner tell me I was not quite ready for that level of client-facing responsibility yet, while both of the men I'd trained sat 2 chairs down from me, already being congratulated. Nobody said the actual word out loud. Nobody had to. I drove home that night and sat in my car in the driveway for a good 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. And when I finally did, I told my husband Ted that I was done asking rooms full of men for permission to be valued. 4 months later, Ellison Consulting Group was born at our kitchen table, a card table in the spare bedroom, a business line that rang off the hook, and a husband who believed in me before I fully believed in myself. Ted used to answer that business line in the evenings when I was in the shower or putting Danielle to bed, and for the first couple of years, half my early clients were convinced Ellison Consulting had a receptionist named Ted with the deepest, most reassuring voice they'd ever heard on a business call. He thought that was the funniest thing in the world. He'd put his hand over the receiver and whisper, "They think I'm very professional," grinning like a kid who'd gotten away with something. Ted and I were married 34 years before cancer took him 3 years ago. I still make 2 cups of coffee some mornings before I remember there's only one of me now. The house holds that kind of quiet you only recognize once you've lived on the other side of it, the kind that used to be filled with someone else's footsteps, someone else's radio station left on in another room and isn't anymore. I've gotten used to a lot of things since. Grocery shopping, for one, is still the hardest part, if I'm honest. I catch myself buying too much bread out of old habit, like there's still somebody else in the house to finish it before it goes stale. My neighbors meant well that first year. They brought casseroles checked in weekly, and then the way life does for everyone, eventually theirs pulled them gently back toward their own families. I don't blame a single one of them for that. Grief has a short shelf life for everyone, except the person still living inside it. Danielle was 7 when I started that company, and if I'm going to tell you the truth about my daughter, I owe you the truth about myself first. Those early years, I was not the mother I had planned on being. I missed a school play because a client threatened to walk if I didn't fly out that same afternoon. I missed her 12th birthday dinner because a deal in Charlotte ran 4 hours long, and I came home to a slice of cake wrapped in foil on the counter and a note in her handwriting that just said, "Saved you some." No anger in it. Just a fact the way a kid states a fact once they've already decided not to expect anything different. I told myself I was building a future for her. I don't think that's how a 7-year-old or a 12-year-old experiences it. I think what she experienced was a mother who showed up reliably in the checkbook and unreliably at the table. So somewhere along the way, when I couldn't give her my time, I started giving her things instead. A car at 16. A better car when that one got old. Her full tuition, no loans, because I'd grown up watching people I loved get crushed under debt for decades after graduation. When she married Terrence Whitlock at 26, I paid for a wedding I probably should have talked her into scaling down, because some part of me was still trying to make up in a check for every dinner I had missed at that table. I called it generosity for a long time. I understand now that a good deal of it was guilt wearing a nicer coat. There was a Tuesday maybe 8 years ago when Danielle called me crying because her old car had died on the interstate, and some clean, honest part of me almost said what I actually meant. "I'm sorry I wasn't there enough when you were small, and I don't know how to fix that now." What came out instead was, "Don't worry about it, baby. I'll have a new one delivered by Friday." She thanked me. She always thanked me sincerely every time. It just never once occurred to either of us in that moment, or the 100 moments like it, that what she actually needed that day wasn't a car. And guilt, I've learned, doesn't ask permission. It just keeps writing checks quietly year after year, until you look up one day and realize you've built your entire relationship with your child out of an apology you never once said with your actual mouth. Terrence is easy to like, good-looking quick with a joke, the kind of son-in-law who hugs you a little too long at Christmas, and always asks about my company like he genuinely wants to know the answer. He started Whitlock Landscaping in his late 20s out of a pickup truck and a single mower, and for a while I was proud of him for it in the specific way you're proud of someone who's trying to build something instead of waiting for it to be handed to them. It did fine for a few years, and then the way small businesses without much cushion behind them often do, it did less than fine. Danielle picked up part-time bookkeeping work for a few of my smaller consulting clients around that same time, work that I will admit, if I'm being fully honest with you, I arranged for her myself, because watching my daughter struggle financially felt like watching my own younger self fail all over again. And then there's Yvonne. Yvonne Whitlock is Terrence's mother, and I want to be fair to her because this isn't really her story to be the villain of, though you may end up feeling differently before we're through. Yvonne is warm in that particular way that costs nothing and asks for nothing back, which I've come to understand is its own kind of currency and maybe the rarest one there is. She hosts brunches with fresh peonies on the table in April. She remembers which of her grandchildren likes pecan pie and which one only wants the crust. I watched her once years ago spend a solid 20 minutes on the floor helping my grandson Jordan build a tower out of couch cushions, laughing every single time it collapsed like she had nowhere else in the world she needed to be. I remember thinking that afternoon that I wanted to be that kind of grandmother someday, the unhurried kind, and wondering if I'm honest whether I still remembered how. For 12 years, Danielle has watched Yvonne move through a room like she was simply born, knowing how to be adored. And I think somewhere in there, my daughter has spent 12 years wanting that particular kind of ease for herself. The kind that has nothing to do with money. Yvonne doesn't have much of it. It has to do with something else. Attention, maybe. Or just the plain absence of an agenda. I didn't understand yet how expensive that comparison was going to become for me. 3 days before Mother's Day, Danielle called. Her voice had that specific politeness she uses when she's already decided something without asking me first. "Mom, we're doing brunch at Yvonne's this year, 1 o'clock. You should come. Not we'd love for you to be there. Not we're so excited to celebrate you. Should come." The way you'd remind someone about a dentist appointment they might otherwise be tempted to skip. There was a small pause on my end of the line, not long, maybe 2 seconds. Just long enough for some old tired part of me to wonder why we weren't hosting it at my house this year, the way we used to when Ted was alive. I didn't say that out loud. I've spent a lifetime learning not to say the small, true things out loud. "Of course, sweetheart," I said. "I wouldn't miss it. Wouldn't miss..." After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, looking at a photograph still taped to my refrigerator. Danielle at 6 years old, gap-toothed, holding out a dandelion toward the camera like it was the finest thing she owned. I'd kept that picture up for 30 years. Standing there, I found myself wondering exactly when she'd stopped handing me things like that, and whether I had simply been too busy back then, closing some deal in some other city, to notice the moment it happened. I had my annual physical that same week as it happened. Nothing dramatic, just the yearly visit my doctor insists on now that I'm past 60. Blood pressure fine, cholesterol fine. "You're going to outlive all of us, Ms. Ellison," she joked on my way out, and I laughed and didn't think about it again for months. I wish I could tell you it stayed that small. That Sunday, I got up before my alarm, the way I still do most mornings, made coffee for one, and stood at my kitchen window longer than I needed to. I thought about calling Danielle just to hear her voice before the day got swallowed up by somebody else's mother. I decided against it. I told myself I didn't want to seem needy on a morning that wasn't really about me anyway. I picked out a blouse I knew Danielle liked. I'd bought a card the week before, nothing extravagant, just something with her handwriting in mind when I sat down to write it. Then I drove the 40 minutes out to Buckhead with the radio off the way I do when I actually want to think. The house when I got there had white columns out front and a circular driveway already crowded with cars worth more than my first 3 years in business combined. I sat in my car for a moment before I went in the way you do, right before stepping into water you already suspect is colder than you're prepared for. I had no idea pulling that door handle that I was about to find out exactly what I was worth to my own family. I only knew that something in my chest had gone very still and very quiet, the particular stillness of a woman who already suspects the answer to a question she hasn't let herself ask out loud yet. The front door was propped open and I could hear laughter spilling out from the backyard before I'd even reached the porch. Yvonne's house always looks like something out of a magazine, white paneling, fresh flowers in the entryway, the kind of effortless order that makes my own home feel by comparison merely functional. "Sonia, so glad you could make it." Yvonne met me in the hallway, her smile warm, and as far as I could tell, completely sincere. She meant it. That's the strange part I keep coming back to even now. In 12 years, Yvonne has never once been unkind to me. Danielle glanced up from across the room and gave me a quick nod. "Hi, Mom. You can sit over there." She gestured toward an empty chair at the far end of a long table set up on the patio off to the side of where everyone else had gathered. I'd like to tell you I didn't notice the geography of it. I noticed all of it. The chair was positioned just far enough from the main conversation that I'd have to raise my voice to be part of it, and just close enough that nobody could reasonably accuse anybody of excluding me on purpose. I sat down. The table in front of me was beautiful, Yvonne's peonies, again cut fresh that morning. By the look of them, arranged in a low crystal bowl, someone had clearly given real thought to. Around me, conversation moved easily between people who'd known each other for years. A cousin of Terrence's, 2 women from Yvonne's book club comparing notes on whatever they'd read that month. A neighbor bouncing a baby on her hip and laughing at something Yvonne had said. Nobody was unkind. Nobody had to be. I simply wasn't woven into any of it the way you can stand in a perfectly warm room and still feel the specific cold of not quite belonging in it. My granddaughter Maya, 4 years old and fearless about most things in life, climbed straight into my lap without being asked, and stayed there through 2 full plates of fruit salad, narrating each strawberry like it deserved its own introduction. Jordan ran past twice chasing a soccer ball, and the second time he stopped just long enough to show me a scraped knee like it was breaking news. That scraped knee is the only reason I laughed at all that afternoon, before things went the way they went. Then Danielle stood up and tapped her glass with a spoon the way people do when they want a room to notice them. "We have something for you," she said, looking at Yvonne with an excitement I hadn't seen directed at anyone in longer than I wanted to admit out loud. Terrence came up beside her, holding a small velvet box in a cream-colored envelope. Yvonne opened the box first. I watched her hand go straight to her chest. Inside was a diamond bracelet, the kind that catches every bit of afternoon light and throws it right back at you. Even from my seat at the far end of the table, I could see it was substantial. Not tasteful and modest substantial. Statement piece substantial. "Honey, this is too much," Yvonne said, and I believed she meant that, too. "It's not too much for the woman who raised such an incredible man," Danielle said, hugging her. "And there's one more thing. The envelope held airline tickets and a folded itinerary. A week in Turks and Caicos, first class and oceanfront suite." Someone at the table said the word gorgeous twice. Yvonne actually cried a little, dabbing under her eyes with a cloth napkin while everyone applauded. I watched Danielle's face while it happened, and I want to be honest with you about what I saw there, because it would be easier now in hindsight if it had looked like calculation. It didn't. It was pure, uncomplicated joy, the kind I hadn't seen on my daughter's face in longer than I could easily remember, and the kind I would have given almost anything a year earlier to be the reason for. I did the math without wanting to. The bracelet alone had to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $20,000. The trip another 8 or 9 on top of that. Nobody else at that table was doing that math except me, and after 30 years spent in rooms full of numbers, it's not really a habit. I know how to switch off, not at a brunch, not about my own family, and certainly not in a moment when I would have given quite a lot not to have the answer. I smiled and clapped along with everyone else anyway, because that's what you do. And because some foolish part of me was still hoping whatever came next for me would somehow even things out. "And for Sonia," Terrence said, and something in his voice had gone a little flatter than it had been a minute earlier. Danielle walked over to me carrying a small paper gift bag, the kind you grab off a rotating rack by the register at a drugstore. Inside was a picture frame, plastic gold tone, the sort that runs about $6, completely empty. No photograph. Just the stock insert still behind the glass. A stranger's stock photo family smiling out at me from some beach I'd never been to. There was a card, too. The front had a printed message about wonderful mothers. Inside, in Danielle's handwriting, it said, "Love you, DT, and the kids." If I turned the frame over, I could still see the corner of a price sticker half peeled, the kind you don't notice you've left on something until later, when you've grabbed it in a hurry on your way out the door. I sat there for a moment, doing something I hadn't expected to have to do in front of 11 people at a brunch table, which was hold my own face very still. I thought about the blouse I'd chosen that morning because I remembered Danielle liked it on me. I thought about the card in my purse, the one I'd actually sat down and written with her handwriting in mind the whole time I composed it. None of that seemed like information anyone at that table needed. "It's lovely," I said, because it was the only sentence I could locate in that moment. "Thank you, sweetheart." Danielle had already turned back to Yvonne, launching into a story about the excursions they'd booked snorkeling somewhere a private chef on the last night. The conversation closed back over them, the way water closes over a dropped stone. I sat there holding a plastic frame with a stranger's family smiling out of it, and I understood quietly and completely exactly how small I had just been made to feel at a table full of people who mostly hadn't even noticed it happen. I stayed another hour. I cleared plates because it gave my hands something useful to do. I watched my daughter lavish more careful attention on a woman she'd known for 12 years than she'd shown me across the last several Mother's Days combined. While I sat at the far end of a table, I would have gladly paid for myself twice over if anyone had thought to ask. When I finally stood up to say I should get going, Danielle barely turned around from whatever she and Yvonne were laughing about. "Thanks for coming, Mom. Drive safe." Terrence at least walked me out to my car, hands in his pockets, quieter than I was used to him being. "Good seeing you, Sonia," he said, and for just a second, standing there in the driveway, he looked like he might say something else. He didn't. I got in my car, and he went back inside. I don't remember most of the drive home. I remember pulling into my own driveway and sitting there with the engine off for a long time, the empty frame still in its little paper bag on the passenger seat. That stranger's family still smiling out of it at absolutely nobody. That night I didn't sleep. My mind kept running the same arithmetic on a loop bracelet trip frame card, $6, 24,000, until somewhere around 2 in the morning, I got up, walked to my home office, and opened my laptop instead of lying there uselessly not sleeping. I told myself I was just going to check the market or pay a bill, anything to give my hands something to do besides lying still in the dark. Instead, I found myself pulling up an account I hadn't looked at closely in years, an emergency fund I'd set up for Danielle 8 years earlier, back when Terrence's business first started wobbling. I'd funded it, kept myself on as a signer, and told myself at the time I'd only ever look at it if something went wrong. I still received the monthly statements by email. I'd simply stopped reading them line by line, the way you eventually stop reading the fine print on anything you've decided once and for all to trust completely. I scrolled back 6 months first. Nothing unusual, a few $100s here and there, the kind of small draws that happen in anybody's life. Then I scrolled back 3 weeks, and I read that one line by line. There, dated 3 weeks before Mother's Day, almost to the day, was a single withdrawal. $24,000 moved out in one transaction, no note attached, no explanation required, because it had never once occurred to either of us that I would need one. I sat very still for a moment. Then I opened a second tab and looked up on nothing but a cold and very specific hunch, roughly what a bracelet like the one I'd watched Yvonne unwrap that afternoon might actually cost. The number that came back was close enough to make my hands go cold in a warm house. My daughter had reached into money I'd set aside specifically to catch her, if she ever fell, and she had spent it making someone else's mother look adored in front of a room full of people whose good opinion she had apparently decided at some point mattered more than mine. I sat in that office chair until the sun came all the way up the laptop screen, the only light left on in the house, thinking about an empty frame on my kitchen counter with a stranger's family still smiling out of it. If she could reach into money I'd set aside for her own safety net and spend it on someone else's affection, I remember thinking then I had no real idea sitting there as the light came up. What else I might have given away over the years without either of us ever once calling it by its name. I closed the laptop, poured out the coffee I'd made hours earlier and never touched, and decided I was finally going to find out. I didn't cry over this next few days. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect a woman my age to fall quietly apart in some corner, and in 30 years of building a business I have never once found that useful. What I did instead was pull every filing cabinet in my home office away from the wall and start reading. Ted used to tease me mercilessly about being a keeper of paper. He called my home office the archive and threatened more than once to buy me a filing cabinet for Christmas as a joke that would also conveniently be a completely real gift. "You never know when you'll need proof," I used to tell him, half joking, standing on a step stool trying to fit one more banker's box onto a closet shelf. He'd just shake his head and go make us both coffee. I never once imagined the thing I'd eventually need proof of was my own motherhood. I gave myself one weekend. I made a pot of coffee. I actually drank this time, spread everything across my dining room table in labeled stacks, and started adding. The first folder was labeled Danielle College. 4 years of tuition, no loans exactly the way I'd wanted it. $52,000 give or take once you counted books and a laptop and the parking tickets she'd somehow racked up freshman year that I'd quietly paid off without ever mentioning it. Then wedding D&T. $61,000 for one Saturday afternoon, the venue, the flowers the photographer, a dress that cost more than my first car. I'd insisted on paying for nearly all of it because some part of me was still trying to buy back every dinner I'd missed when she was small. Then the Folder Market House Buckhead. When Danielle and Terrence found the house, they wanted their combined income wasn't quite enough to qualify for the mortgage on their own. I'd written a check for the down payment, $175,000, and told myself at the time that it was simply what a mother did. I was still a co-signer on the mortgage itself, to a detail I'd never bothered updating in the years since, because it had never once occurred to me that it needed updating. Somewhere around $540,000 in remaining principal sat on that loan with my name attached to it, exactly as thoroughly as Danielle and Terrence's. Then Whitlock landscaping emergency, $95,000 wired in a single afternoon 3 years ago when Terrence's business nearly went under, and Danielle called me crying so hard I could barely make out the words. No contract, no repayment plan, just a mother doing what a mother does. And then a folder with no label at all, just years of smaller things. I'd stopped bothering to track individually car repairs, a laptop for Jordan's school, a few thousand here and there, whenever somebody needed a little help getting through a rough month. I added those up as best I could. $75,000 conservatively. I sat back in my chair and looked at the number on my calculator. $458,000. Over 15 years. More money than most people see across an entire working life. And a week ago, I'd gotten an empty picture frame from the dollar store. The truly painful part wasn't the number itself. I'd built a company that could absorb it. The painful part was understanding all at once that my own generosity had become so invisible to my daughter that it no longer registered as generosity at all. It had simply become the baseline. The thing that was quietly, reliably always there, the way you stop noticing a ceiling is holding your roof up until the day it doesn't. I almost stopped there. I told myself I had my answer, and that the answer was enough to sit with for a while. Then I remembered the loan. 2 years ago, when Whitlock Landscaping was still finding its footing after that first crisis, Terrence needed $180,000 for a second truck and a crew's worth of equipment for a contract he'd landed with a property management company. The bank wanted a personal guarantee before releasing the funds. Terrence and Danielle didn't have the collateral. I did. I remembered signing that guarantee in about 15 minutes standing in a bank lobby because Danielle was in the car outside crying, and I hadn't wanted to make her wait any longer than she already had. I did not remember reading the fine print as carefully as I should have. It took me 2 hours with the actual loan document spread across my dining room table, a highlighter in one hand, and my reading glasses pushed up into my hair before I found the clause that made my stomach drop. It sat on page 11 in the kind of dense legal language specifically designed to be skimmed past by exhausted people, signing things quickly in bank lobbies. I called my banker at 11 o'clock that night, which I'm not proud of, and made him walk me through it twice before I was certain I understood it correctly. The guarantee wasn't just my word on a piece of paper. It was cross-collateralized against my own commercial building on Peachtree Street, the building that houses Ellison Consulting Group, the company I had built from a card table in a spare bedroom over 3 decades. If Whitlock Landscaping ever defaulted on that loan for any reason at all, the bank had a direct legal claim against my building. I sat at my dining room table well past midnight, with $458,000 of gifts on one side of the ledger and $180,000 of fresh exposure on the other. And I understood, finally, that this had stopped being a story about hurt feelings on a Sunday afternoon. This was a story about risk. My risk sitting quietly in someone else's hands, waiting for someone else's bad year to become mine. I called my attorney the next morning. Angela Ford has handled my legal affairs for 11 years, ever since the man who handled them before her retired. Her office looks out over downtown Atlanta high enough that I can usually pick out my own building on Peachtree Street from her window, which has always felt like a small, private kind of pride. "You look tired, Sonia," she said, settling behind her desk with a cup of tea she never quite got around to drinking. "What's on your mind?" I'd rehearsed this conversation the entire drive over, and every version of it evaporated the moment I actually sat down across from her. "I want to talk about selling the company," I said. Angela's eyebrows went up just slightly, the only tell she ever allows herself. Ellison Consulting. You've spent 30 years building that. I know. Last time we spoke, you were talking about bringing on a junior partner, maybe grooming Danielle to eventually take over the client relationships. She said it carefully, the way you test a floorboard before putting your full weight on it. I know that too, so I told her everything. The empty frame, the bracelet, the emergency fund drained by exactly the amount of that bracelet 3 weeks before I ever saw it on Yvonne's wrist. And then the guarantee, the $180,000 sitting against my own building, signed in 15 minutes in a bank lobby, because I hadn't wanted my daughter to wait in the car any longer than necessary. Angela listened without interrupting, though I watched her wince once at the exact dollar figure on the guarantee. Okay, she said when I finished. Let's separate two things because I think you're carrying them as one problem, and they're actually two. The first is the exposure. That guarantee is a real immediate risk to your primary asset, and it needs resolving regardless of how you're feeling about anyone right now. The second is everything else. And the second one, Sonia, you get to decide on your own timeline. What does resolving the first one actually look like? Realistically, we use proceeds from a sale or a partial sale to satisfy or renegotiate the guarantee directly, and we make certain nothing you own personally is ever cross-collateralized against someone else's business again. A clean separation. It's the kind of thing I'd advise any client to do the moment they discovered what you discovered, whether or not there had ever been a Mother's Day at all. I sat with that for a moment. It was, I realized, a tremendous relief to have a lawyer tell me that the thing I already wanted to do was also simply the responsible thing to do. I hadn't quite understood how much permission I'd been waiting for to stop feeling like any of this was about revenge. How long does something like this actually take? I asked. For a firm your size with your client relationships, 3 to 6 months if we move efficiently. I have contacts in business brokerage who specialize in consulting practices exactly like yours. I could reach out this week. Angela paused, studying me the way she does right before she says something she thinks I need to hear, rather than something I want to hear. Sonia, I have to ask, is there a version of this where you restructure things more gradually instead? Transition the financial support over time rather than all at once? No, I said, and I surprised myself with how immediately the answer came. Gradual gives people time to adjust. Time to find new ways around whatever boundary I try to draw. If I'm doing this, it needs to be clean. Then let's do it, I said. Cleanly, quietly. I don't want anyone to know until it's finished. You understand there's no walking it back once it's done. I'm counting on that. Setting up something for Jordan and Maya was the easiest decision I made that whole month. Angela helped me establish an irrevocable trust in both their names. The Jordan and Maya Educational Trust funded separately from anything to do with their parents structured, so that neither Danielle nor Terrence could ever access it, borrow against it, or so much as see the balance. The money would simply sit untouched, earning what it earned until each of them turned 18. College, or whatever college ended up looking like for them by then. No strings attached. No parental hands anywhere near it. I wanted my grandchildren to have exactly what I'd once tried to give their mother, real opportunity, without any debt quietly attached to it, financial or otherwise. I only wanted to make certain this time that it went directly to the people it was actually for, without passing first through anyone else's hands or anyone else's idea of what they deserved. If I had learned anything at all in the last 2 weeks, it was that love handed over without any structure around it doesn't always arrive where you meant it to. It was around then, in the middle of all that quiet paperwork, that Terrence stopped by unannounced on a Tuesday evening, saying he'd been finishing a landscaping job 2 streets over and figured he'd drop off a ladder he'd borrowed from Ted years ago and never quite gotten around to returning. It was a kind gesture, the sort of small thing that had always made him easy to have in the family. He asked about my week the way he always does, like he genuinely wanted the real answer and not the polite one. And I found myself almost telling him. I didn't. We stood in my kitchen for a few minutes while he noticed entirely unprompted that a cabinet hinge had been squeaking for months, and insisted on fixing it right then with a screwdriver from his truck, refusing to leave until it stopped. I remember thinking, watching him work, that this was exactly the kind of small, unasked-for kindness that had made me trust him in the first place. His phone sat face up on my counter the whole time, and I wasn't looking at it. Not really until it buzzed once and lit up on its own. I want to be honest with you here, because I think it matters. I didn't pick it up. I didn't unlock it. I was standing exactly where I'd been standing, reaching past it for a dish towel, when the notification banner simply appeared at the top of the screen, the way they do whether you want to see them or not. Danielle or Mom said focus on the right relationship before any will talk starts. Just make Mother's Day count, that's Al. The message cut off there, swallowed by the edge of the screen. His phone buzzed again a second later, and the banner disappeared, replaced by something else entirely. A grocery list or a sports score, I honestly don't remember. Terrence never noticed a thing. He finished the hinge, hugged me a little too long the way he always does, and left. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after his truck pulled out of the driveway. Mother's Day hadn't been an accident. It hadn't even really been about Yvonne, not primarily. Somewhere at some point I would never be able to fully pin down my daughter, and son-in-law had sat down and discussed as a strategy, as an actual plan with a before and an after, exactly how to position themselves ahead of any conversation about what I might eventually leave behind. I had spent 2 weeks quietly protecting myself from a risk I'd stumbled into completely by accident. It had never once occurred to me until that moment, standing in my own kitchen with a dish towel still in my hand, that some of what was coming for me might not have been an accident at all. I didn't confront him. I didn't confront anyone. I have found across 30 years in business that the version of yourself who reacts immediately is rarely the version who ends up protecting herself best. Instead, over the following 2 weeks, I made a series of small, entirely unremarkable decisions. I called the property management company that had connected Whitlock Landscaping with 2 of my commercial accounts, and mentioned casually that I was reviewing all my vendor relationships as part of a broader restructuring. I called 3 of my smaller consulting clients who'd been using Danielle for part-time bookkeeping and let them know in the same even professional tone I use for everything that I'd be simplifying my referral network over the next 60 days. Nothing dramatic, nothing that couldn't be explained a dozen innocent ways. Just a quiet loosening one thread at a time of a financial web I'd spent 15 years weaving without ever quite meaning to. Danielle called that same week, her voice tighter than I'd heard it in years. Mom, Mrs. Patterson said you're not sending bookkeeping referrals anymore. I need those clients. That's actual income for us. I'm sure you'll find other opportunities, I said. You're very capable. That's not really an answer. It's the only one I have for you right now. There was a long pause on her end of the line, long enough that I could hear Jordan's cartoons playing somewhere in the background of her house. Mom, is everything okay? You've been acting strange lately. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just handling some business matters. Terrence said people at the Chamber of Commerce are saying things about the company. People say a lot of things, honey. I kept my voice as even as I've ever kept it in my life. If there's ever anything you actually need to know, you'll hear it from me first. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a moment, looking at that empty picture frame, which I still hadn't thrown away, sitting exactly where I'd left it. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something that wasn't grief and wasn't quite anger either. It was closer to clarity. And underneath the clarity, quiet and unfamiliar after all these years, something that felt almost like control. Nearly 2 months into the process, Angela called with an update. She'd found a buyer, a larger regional consulting firm out of Charlotte, looking to expand into exactly the kind of client relationships I'd spent 30 years building in the Atlanta market. The offer, when she read me the number, came in nearly 20% above what either of us had projected going in. They want your name to stay on for transition consulting part-time for the first year, Angela said. And they want to keep the Peachtree office open under a new name. This could close within a few weeks if you're ready to move that quickly. I'm more than ready, I told her, and I found myself surprised by how true that felt saying it out loud. That same week, on something close to a whim, I drove 2 hours out to Lake Oconee to look at a cottage a realtor friend had mentioned. Nothing serious, I told myself. just looking the way you look at a life you haven't quite decided to let yourself want yet. The cottage was small and a little worn around the edges. Nothing like the house in Buckhead I'd helped pay for, and I found myself liking it precisely because of that. I stayed 3 days, walked the property twice, sat on a dock that wasn't mine, and watched the water for longer than I probably needed to, and let myself imagine, just for those 3 days, a version of my life that didn't require managing anyone's crisis but my own. Danielle still had a key to my house. She'd had one since she was 17, and it had simply never occurred to me across all the years since that there was any reason to ask for it back. She used to let herself in to water my plants or grab something from the garage without a second thought, and I'd always liked that about our relationship, the ease of it, the assumption that my home was still a little bit hers, too. I think if you'd asked me even a month earlier, I would have told you that Key was one of the last remaining proofs I had that she still thought of this house as partly her own home too, and not just mine. I found out later from Angela, who heard it from Gerald Simmons, the broker handling the sale, that Danielle had let herself into my house while I was at the lake, telling herself I imagined that she was simply checking on things the way she always had. What she was actually doing, I have to assume, was looking for whatever reassurance the house itself might offer her, since I hadn't been offering any. While she was there, my home office phone rang. Gerald had been trying to reach my cell to confirm a signing date and misdialed 1-digit landing on my house line instead. A woman answered, and when he asked for Ms. Ellison, she told him I was traveling, but that she was helping out with a few things in my absence and could take a message. He had absolutely no reason to doubt her. Why would he? So he walked her through the closing timeline in some detail. The buyer's name. The expected date, just under 3 weeks out. The fact that everything was on track and there was nothing left to hold things up. He even mentioned in passing that the confidentiality agreements were the last piece still being finalized, which meant Danielle now understood not only that the sale was real, but that I had gone out of my way to make certain she wouldn't hear about it from anyone but me. I want to tell you exactly what I felt when Angela relayed all this to me, because I think it matters. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was something colder and more specific than that, the particular feeling of a puzzle piece you'd been holding at the wrong angle suddenly clicking into place. I packed my bag and drove back from the lake that same afternoon, 3 hours, with both hands tight on the wheel, running through every innocent explanation I could think of, and finding that none of them held together for more than a few seconds at a time. I thought about that key, and about how many times over the years I'd handed my daughter access to something of mine without a second thought. It had apparently never once occurred to either of us that access could be used for anything other than exactly what I'd intended it for. The house was quiet when I pulled into my own driveway, except that Danielle's car was parked exactly where mine usually sits, and my front door, the one I am completely certain I locked before I left the way I lock it every single time I leave this house, was standing very slightly open. I stood in my own entryway for a moment listening. The house had that particular held-breath quality of a space where someone doesn't yet know they've been discovered. I walked toward my home office because some old instinct in me already knew exactly where I'd find her. I found her in my chair at my desk with a manila folder open across her lap. I recognized it before she even looked up. Angela's office prints estate documents on the same heavy cream-colored paper every time a habit I'd noticed years ago and never once mentioned to anyone. Danielle's finger was resting on a page and her eyes came up to meet mine with an expression I don't think I'll ever fully stop remembering, not quite caught, not quite innocent, suspended somewhere in the half-second before a person decides which version of themselves they're going to be. "Find what you were looking for?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. I watched her glance down at the page under her finger, a beneficiary schedule from a will I hadn't finished revising, and then back up at me. "Mom, I can explain." "You're looking for your own name," I said. It wasn't really a question anymore. "You let yourself into my house while I was out of town, and you are sitting in my office in my chair looking for your own name in my will. I was worried about you. Nobody would tell me anything, and Terrence kept saying people were talking at the Chamber of Commerce, and I panicked. You told a stranger on the phone that you were helping me with things." Her face went very still. "I didn't say I worked for you exactly. I just didn't correct him." "That's the same thing, and you know it's the same thing. She didn't argue with that. That more than anything else that afternoon told me how much she already understood about what she'd done. Danielle. I said her name the way I used to say it when she was 7 years old and about to do something she already knew better than to do. Close the folder, put it back exactly where you found it, and get out of my office. She closed it, her hands shaking slightly. Some small, tired part of me noticed that, filed it away, and did not let it change a single thing I'd already decided. Mom, please, can we just talk about not right now? She left without another word. I stood in my own office for a long time after her car pulled out of the driveway, looking at the folder sitting exactly where she'd left it at the desk, where my daughter had just spent an afternoon searching for evidence of how much I still valued her, instead of simply asking me. That evening, I sat on my back porch with a glass of wine I barely touched, replaying the look on her face when she'd glanced up from that folder. It hadn't been guilt, exactly. It had looked more like long division, the specific expression of someone working out in real time exactly how much trouble they were actually in. I thought about calling Terrence, warning him what had happened before Danielle had the chance to tell it her own way. I decided against it. Let them have their own conversation about it first, without me managing the delivery. I was tired in a way I hadn't fully admitted to myself, until that exact moment of being the one who smoothed everyone else's feelings before they'd even had the chance to feel them fully on their own. The call started the next morning at 6:47. I let the first one go to voicemail. It rang again almost immediately. By the time I'd finished my coffee, I'd stopped counting anything except the number climbing steadily on my phone screen. I answered on the 13th call, mostly because the silence after each one had started to feel worse than whatever she was actually going to say. Mom, please, we need to talk about this. We talked yesterday, Danielle. You can't just destroy everything because you're upset about a stupid Mother's Day gift. I set my coffee down. This was never about one gift, and I think you know that better than you're letting on. Then what is it about? What do you actually want from me? I want you to understand that I am not a line item in your budget. She hung up, called back within the minute, then again, then again. By 10 o'clock, she had called 19 times, and I had stopped answering. Each voicemail took a slightly different shape, the way desperation tends to cycle through whatever forms are still available to it once the first one stops working. Mom, please call me back. We can figure this out. Mom, Terrence is having chest pains. The stress isn't good for him. Is that really what you want, Mom? I'm sorry about the frame. I'll make it up to you. Just please don't sell the company. Mom, everyone at church is going to ask me what happened. What am I even supposed to tell them? Mom, people are going to think you're being cruel and vindictive. Is that honestly how you want to be remembered? I listened to every single one of them sitting at my kitchen table with my phone face up in front of me, and somewhere around the 15th message I understood with real clarity that I wasn't listening to my daughter grieve our relationship. I was listening to her grieve the arrangement. Not one of those 19 calls asked how I was doing or whether I was all right, or what had actually happened to make me do this. Every single one was about what she stood to lose. By early afternoon, the calls simply stopped, the way a storm sometimes does not, because anything had actually been resolved, but because it had finally exhausted itself for the day. Terrence called exactly once later that evening after Danielle's calls had finally stopped. Sonia, I owe you an apology, he said, and I could hear for the first time in longer than I could remember something that sounded like real shame in his voice rather than performance. I didn't know she was going to do that. Go into your house like that. I need you to know that. I believe you, I said, and I meant it. Whatever else Terrence had done or failed to do over the years breaking into my house had never once been his particular sin. For what it's worth, he said, I think some of this is on me too. I should have said something a long time ago about how much we let ourselves depend on you. I let it become normal. That part's on me. It was, I think, the most honest thing anyone in my family had said to me in longer than a year, and it came from the person I'd least expected to say it. I told him I appreciated it. I did not tell him that it changed anything about what I'd already decided to do, because it hadn't, and I thought he deserved the truth from me more than he deserved my comfort right then. I called Angela instead. Let's move as fast as the buyer is willing to move, I told her. I don't want to give anyone more time to find another way around this. "I can have documents ready for signature by Friday," she said. "Then let's sign on Friday." I hung up and sat for a while in the quiet of my own kitchen, the same kitchen where an empty picture frame had sat on the counter for weeks. Now a small, stubborn thing I still hadn't let myself throw away. I thought about how strange it was that the thing which had finally moved me to act hadn't been the bracelet or the trip, or even the guarantee sitting against my building. It had been a phone call I hadn't even taken myself answered by someone pretending for just long enough to be someone she wasn't. The 3 days between that call and Friday felt strange in a way I hadn't expected, not peaceful exactly, but no longer frantic either. Nobody called. Nobody showed up at my door. I found myself once or twice almost missing the noise of it all the way you sometimes miss an argument once it's finally over, simply because the noise had meant somebody was still trying. We signed on Friday exactly as planned. Angela's office smelled like coffee and new paper, and it took 11 minutes from the first signature to the last 11 minutes to close a chapter that had taken 30 years to write. Nobody from my family was there. I hadn't invited them, and none of them had asked to come, which told me something too, though I was too tired that particular morning to sit with exactly what it told me. I remember thinking driving home afterward that something which had taken 15 years to knot itself into a nearly $500,000 tangle had come undone in less time than it takes to get a haircut. Danielle came to see me 4 days later. Alone this time, no Terrence waiting in the car, no folder, no rehearsed opening line. She looked when I opened the door like someone who had finally stopped performing for an audience that had already left the room. "I'm not here to ask you to stop," she said before I'd even fully opened the door. "I know it's done." "It's done," I confirmed. She stood on my porch for a moment, hands jammed into her jacket pockets, looking younger than her 36 years in a way that caught me off guard. "I don't need you to change your mind, Mom. I just need to know one thing." "What's that?" "Am I still your daughter?" Her voice cracked slightly on the word daughter, and I watched her work to hold the rest of her face steady around it. "Underneath all of this, is that still true?" I want to tell you I had a clean, generous answer ready for her. I didn't. Some part of me wanted badly to simply say yes, and let us both go back inside out of the cold. But I had spent 36 years handing my daughter easy answers whenever the honest one would have cost me something, and I was done doing that even here, even now, even with her standing on my porch looking like she might come apart at the seams. "I don't know," I said as honestly as I have ever said anything to anyone in my life. "Ask me again once you've figured out the answer to that question for yourself." She nodded slowly like she'd expected exactly that, and had come anyway, needing to hear it out loud rather than simply imagine it in private. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just turned around and walked back to her car, and I stood in my doorway and watched her taillights disappear down the street. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt like someone standing in the wreckage of something still deciding whether it was worth rebuilding or simply worth walking away from entirely. A few days after that, Danielle and Terrence came together. Something about the two of them standing on my porch side by side rather than one at a time put me on alert before either of them said a single word. We sat in my living room, all three of us stiffer than we had ever once been, even at our worst family dinners. Danielle did most of the talking, something about how they understood things were final now, how they just wanted to make sure the family stayed connected going forward, how they didn't want the grandchildren to lose their grandmother over any of this. I let her talk. I found over enough years that people usually tell you what they actually came to say somewhere in the second half of a conversation, once they've used up the part they rehearsed on the drive over. It was Terrence who slipped. "We just want to make sure everything's clear going forward," he said, "in case anything ever happens. We actually talked to a lawyer a few weeks back about, in case your health ever—" He stopped. I watched the exact moment he heard what he'd just said out loud, the way you can sometimes watch a person realize 1/2 second too late that a door they never meant to open has swung all the way open anyway. "My health," I repeated. "I just meant, I had a physical 2 months ago," I said. "Perfectly normal. Blood pressure fine. Cholesterol fine. My doctor told me I was going to outlive all of you." I watched his face while I said it, watched him understand in real time exactly which conversation he'd just accidentally confirmed had actually taken place. You talk to a lawyer about who gets to make decisions for me while I am sitting here in complete possession of every single one of my own faculties in my own home, having this exact conversation with you. Nobody said anything for a long moment. It wasn't like that, Danielle said too quickly. Then what was it like? She didn't have an answer. I don't think watching her face in that moment that she'd ever actually let herself ask that question before I asked it for her. I sat back in my chair and looked at the two of them, my daughter and the man she'd married, both of them still young enough to have decades of their own lives ahead of them, sitting in my living room, having apparently already discussed. At some point, I would never fully know who would eventually take charge of mine. I have spent decades being the person in this family who handles things so nobody else has to worry, I said. I have never once needed anyone to plan for my incapacity while I was standing right in front of them, fully capable, telling them so myself. Mom, my love was never for sale, I said. But it turns out yours had a price all along, and I think I just finished paying it in full. I stood up. That was the end of the conversation as far as I was concerned, and something in the way I stood told them so without my needing to say another word. They left. I did not walk them to the door. 3 months after the sale closed, I moved into that cottage on Lake Oconee. It was smaller than the house I left behind, and it suited me exactly that much better for it. No rooms sized for entertaining people who no longer visited. No echo of arguments I was tired of having. Just a porch, a dock, and water that changed color every single evening, whether or not anyone was there to see it. I brought almost nothing from the old house. A few photographs. Ted's favorite books still slightly out of order the way he always kept them. The quilt my own mother made the year Danielle was born, which I finally unpacked from a box it had sat in for over a decade. I did not bring the empty picture frame. I left that behind on the kitchen counter of the house I no longer live in, and I have never once missed it. The Jordan and Maya Educational Trust became fully active that same month, untouched by anyone but the 2 children it was built for. And with a portion of the sale proceeds, I started something new. The Ellison Fund, a scholarship and mentorship program for young Black women starting their own businesses. The exact kind of support nobody had offered me at their age, in rooms where I'd had to fight for every single seat at the table. Aisha, the client I'd once walked through her first commercial lease, was the first name on the list, and I made sure she knew it came with no strings and no expectation of gratitude attached. Doing that felt less like generosity and more like closing a loop that had been sitting open for 35 years. Angela texted me the news 4 months later, gently the way she does most things. Whitlock Landscaping had filed for bankruptcy. Danielle and Terrence had separated, and she'd started substitute teaching at the elementary school 2 towns over. I felt something reading that. Not triumph, I want to be clear about that, because I know some of you watching might want me to say I did. What I felt was closer to a specific quiet sadness, the kind you feel for people who made choices you can no longer undo for them, followed almost immediately by the recognition that it had genuinely stopped being my responsibility to undo them. My neighbor across the lake, Denise Calloway, invited me to dinner not long after that. We'd become the sort of friends who wave from our respective docks most mornings, and this time her son and daughter-in-law were visiting for the weekend, and she wanted me to meet them properly. I watched the 3 of them together that evening, Denise's son refilling her wine before she'd even noticed her glass was empty. Her daughter-in-law asking real questions about Denise's garden and actually waiting around for the answers. The easy, unremarkable warmth of people who simply enjoy being in a room together. Nobody was keeping score. Nobody needed to be. At one point, Denise laughed so hard at something her son said that she had to set her fork down, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I had laughed like that, at my own table, surrounded by my own family. I drove home that night thinking that I finally understood all these months later exactly what I'd been missing for so long, and exactly what it had never actually been supposed to cost. 6 months after I moved, a letter arrived. Not a text, an actual handwritten letter, the return address in Danielle's writing, though the hand inside looked more careful than I remembered it ever being. She wrote that she and Terrence were finalizing the divorce, that she'd been substitute teaching, and that some mornings it was the hardest work she'd ever done, and also unexpectedly the most honest work she'd ever done. She wrote that Jordan had asked her once why Grandma didn't visit anymore, and that she hadn't known how to answer him without either lying to a 7-year-old or telling him the truth about his own mother. She wrote that she understood now why I'd sold the company, not as punishment, she said, but as the only way either of us was ever going to find out who she really was underneath everything I'd been quietly paying for on her behalf. She wrote that she still had the picture frame, that she'd finally put a photograph in it, one of the two of us from a trip to the beach when she was maybe 5 years old, the only one she could find where we were both laughing at the exact same thing at the exact same moment. It sits on her kitchen windowsill now, she wrote, and some mornings she looks at it before she looks at anything else. She didn't ask me to forgive her. She said she wasn't writing to ask for that. She only wanted me to know that she finally understood what I'd been trying to tell her for far longer than one Mother's Day, that love isn't a transaction, and it never should have had to become one in our family for either of us to notice that it had. I sat on my porch a long time after I finished reading it, watching the light change on the water. Then I went inside and wrote her back. I still have that letter. I haven't mailed it yet. Some things I've learned need time to heal all the way through before it's safe to reopen them at all. I'm 66 years old now. I built a company from nothing, gave away nearly $500,000 trying to say I love you in a language that apparently never once translated, and it took an empty picture frame to finally teach me the difference between being needed and being loved. I didn't walk away from my family. I only stopped being the only one paying to stay in it.